Formula 1 is under fire in 2023, with driver criticisms of the regulations and a groundswell of fan complaints about processional races, the lack of overtaking and dominance by one team. It's a narrative that has played out repeatedly in the 21st century, which has been one of dominant spells interspersed with occasional interregnums. First it was Ferrari, then Red Bull, then Mercedes before Red Bull reasserted itself as F1's leading team. Through that time, there were periodic existential crises with repeated rule changes, new ideas, and supposed performance balancing measures that rarely had the desired effect. Hopes were high when F1's new ground effect regulations were introduced, but of late, drivers have offered a string of criticisms for the perceived lack of overtaking and excitement. Collectively, they have focused their complaints on 5 areas. One of the main aims of the 2022 regulations was to reduce the outwash effect that contributed to making the turbulence behind the car worse. This followed in-depth analysis of the weight characteristics of F1 cars, with the regulations framed to reduce how dirty the air was for a chasing car. But knowledge is not forgotten, and it was inevitable teams would attempt to create the outwash effect that is good for performance, given it can reduce drag and allow better airflow management across the whole car. A good example of that was the rear wing end plate design Aston Martin introduced in Hungary last year, or the Mercedes front wing end plate concept that first appeared in Miami 2022. Both designs were outlawed for 2023, but it's symptomatic of the problem that Mercedes this year has a similar front wing end plate, but one that complies with the regulations designed to stop it. As George Russell said, ongoing aerodynamic development has inevitably resulted in the teams developing away from the initial intention of the rules. Russell also argued overtaking is getting more difficult, partly because the slipstream effect isn't as big as it used to be. Given the combined might of the 10 F1 teams in terms of design and development is vastly bigger than that of the rulemakers, the FIA is outgunned on this. There will always be the push and pull of F1 regulations designed to increase the raceability of the cars, and designs counteracting that work, regardless of whether you have ground effect cars, flat bottom cars, or some other concept entirely. The laws of physics are immutable, and short of running F1 races in a vacuum, there will always be some kind of dirty air effect. Likewise, any attempt to manipulate the wake to reduce that runs the risk of reducing the slipstream effect. Realistically, all the FIA can do for the next few years is make adjustments to contain the problem and prevent it getting worse. The next big opportunity to tackle this will be the 2026 regulations, when movable aero and lighter, smaller cars are on the agenda. Given Formula 1 drivers are involved, it's inevitable that the Pirelli tyres have also come in for criticism. That's been a common theme ever since the Italian manufacturer returned to F1 as control tyre supplier in 2011. There are 2 problems here. The first, as Carlos Sainz has pointed out, is the overheating of the tyre surface. This goes hand in hand with the problem of following in turbulent air. As Sainz says, when following you lose a bit of traction, braking grip and start sliding. If you slide around on the tyres, that causes more of the dreaded surface overheating, which reduces the grip and causes yet more sliding. As a result, Sainz says, you are only able to follow for 1 or 2 laps, then you have to back off. Then there's the question of tyre degradation. One-stop races have been the norm this year, which leaves minimal room for strategic variety. The lack of thermal degradation also reduces the chances of performance variables that cause overtaking. As Alpine's Esteban Ocon pointed out, Bahrain produced more overtaking because it was a high degradation race, but there was no deg in Australia, no deg in Jeddah, no deg in Baku, according to him. The same applied in Miami, where the majority one-stopped. It's inevitable in any controlled tyre formula that tyres will be criticised. Pirelli worked to reduce the surface overheating when it introduced its low-profile tyres to be mounted on the larger 18-inch wheel rims at the start of last year. Some improvements were made, but particularly once cars start sliding around in turbulent air, some degree of overheating is unavoidable. There's room for improvements, although bearing in mind the weight of the cars, there is a limit to what is possible. Criticism of one-stop races is legitimate given Pirelli has been aiming ideally for 2-stop races, preferably with a range of strategy options. The tyre degradation in Jeddah, Melbourne, Baku and Miami was low, which led to one-stoppers. But Pirelli is working within the constraints of trying to do the whole season with just 6 different compounds to cover 23 different track configurations, each with varying surfaces. It's fair to ask for more from Pirelli, but it's also important not to expect the impossible. Red Bull's performance advantage in races is such that overtaking is relatively easy for its drivers, as proved by Max Verstappen's brilliant charge from 9th on the grid to victory in Miami. But the chasing pack of Aston Martin, Ferrari and Mercedes is almost too close together. That's what Fernando Alonso argues. He points out that F1 has always been about domination by a single team. This is Formula 1, as he put it. While it would be more accurate to say often rather than always, you can see where he's coming from. But Alonso actually argues the group behind is too close. Red Bull's advantage is probably the most significant reason for the complaints, but Red Bull is not to blame for this. The team is doing a brilliant job and reaping the reward. If anything, Mercedes and Ferrari should be held responsible for failing to do a better job. But this is a warning not to leap to conclusions. Were Red Bull not on the grid, it's likely this season would be considered a thrilling seesaw battle between the Ferraris, Mercedes and Aston Martin drivers. A classic, even. Alonso's point about the chasing pack being too close to make overtaking possible is valid, given its performance differentials and variables across a race that lead to overtaking and back and forth racing. However, one of the aims of the regs is rightly to ensure the field is not too widely spread, which is logical because if you have clear performance gaps between cars and start them all in pace order, that's also an ingredient for processions. This is something that interacts with complaints about lack of tyre deg, as that can create pace offsets between cars of fundamentally similar pace. In both Baku and Miami, DRS zones were shortened for 2023. Drivers are convinced that was a major factor in the flatness of the Azerbaijan Grand Prix, although in Miami there was far more passing. While few are big fans of DRS passes, it's a necessary evil in modern F1. As Pierre Gasly says, if overtaking is the objective, then smaller DRS zones isn't necessarily the way to achieve it. The DRS zones are infinitely tunable. The answer to the criticism here would be the FIA being more dynamic in how it adjusts the zones, not just to ensure overtaking is possible, but also that it's not too easy. The trouble is, different cars have different potency of DRS effects, so adjusting the zone will always benefit or hurt someone. Ideally, the DRS zones introduced in 2011 would be redundant now, but they remain a fact of life in F1 for now and the immediate future. Max Verstappen came up with an interesting observation, suggesting heavier cars and stiff setups to maximise ground effect downforce have had an impact on reducing the on-track drama. His argument is that this reduces what he calls that little bit of magic in terms of things like curb riding, especially on street tracks, that can give you that crucial advantage when trying to make a move. Verstappen also pointed to the long-standing problem of the growing weight of F1 cars. The minimum weight is now 798 kilos. It's a concerning trend that F1 cars have become so much larger and heavier over the past decade. There are reasons for it, such as the ever-improving safety systems and the hybrid power unit, but it has made the cars lazier. What's more, the drivers are right to point out the current ground effect cars don't ride curbs as well, and therefore allow less innovative use of lines and restrict the forms of attack. The FIA has plans to tackle this. One of the stated aims of the 2026 rules overhaul is to make the cars lighter and smaller, or at the very least contain the growth. But it won't be transformative. The FIA has identified around 35 kilos as the weight-saving opportunity once essential mass is accounted for, so while shaving off some of that will be an improvement, it's hard to see F1 ever returning to the lightweight cars of the first decade of the 21st century. Inevitably, when the racing is seen by fans as predictable, there are complaints, but the fact drivers are also piping up with criticism is food for thought for the rulemakers. The challenge now is to decide which of these weaknesses can be improved, either with immediate action or, more likely, long-term changes with the 2026 rules. After all, it's easy to point out the problems, but far more difficult to find the solutions.